Hello, and thanks for joining us on In the Zone, our series of interviews from the Middle East Treaty Organization, digging underneath the debates around banning weapons of mass destruction from the region. I'm your co-host, Jacob.
And I'm Anahita. Today we're talking to Christina Kelly of Youth for TPNW, an independent youth-led global movement calling for a world free from nuclear weapons. Christina also works with UN House Scotland, whose vision is that people become actively engaged with the values and goals of the UN: human rights, sustainable development, peace and security.
Thank you so much, Christina, for joining us. First up, I think I'm just quite interested to hear a little bit more about what Youth for TPNW actually is.
Well, yeah, thank you very much for having me. So Youth for TPNW is, kind of as the name suggests, a youth organization advocating for and supporting the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And so we're trying to do this basically under the idea that there needs to be someone advocating for the future generations. And we feel like youth representation is a great way to do that. And we're trying to ensure that not only is there youth representation that exists, but also that it is effectively taken into account in disarmament diplomacy. And so it's trying to ensure that whenever we actually have our voices heard, they're also implemented as other civil society organizations would be. And so Youth for TPNW right now is organizing a youth MSP, so a youth meeting of states parties, that will precede the actual meeting of states parties for the TPNW, which means that our findings will be incorporated into the civil society portion of the official MSP, which hopefully means that our voices will be heard.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. So I know you touched on it briefly, but why do you think youth representation is so important on an issue like this?
I think the first really important one is that, it's our futures. And so we want to make sure that we are advocating for our own futures and not leaving it to other people who have less skin in the game. So that's the really important kind of cliched one that a lot of people say about youth representation. So the younger populations make up a large proportion of civil society and are the ones directly impacted by these issues in the future. So it's important to make sure that our voices are heard and we get to decide what the future of nuclear disarmament is going to look like. Also, it's important to understand that as we move further and further away from 1945 and from the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, people seem to think that the threat is decreasing. I think that's the kind of very common understanding, is because we're no longer in a Cold War or we're no longer in a world war, that we are not at threat of nuclear war. But the reality is that the threat of nuclear war is greater today than it was in 1945, and it's greater than it ever was at any point in the Cold War. And so it's so important for us to confront this issue now. And that's why we are trying to ensure that this issue continues to be confronted and not is left to older civil society organizations that may consider this issue in a different perspective.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think there's something to be said about the fact that if there's an organization called Youth for TPNW and there is so much work going into making sure that youth representation is implemented, it must mean that obviously we've already acknowledged that there's a lack of youth involvement, active involvement, and also representation. But why? What would you consider some of the difficulties and challenges around actually getting that implementation in place?
I think starting off is when you look at civil society organizations, a lot of them are built off of voluntary participation. Youth for TPNW is a voluntary organization in and of itself. And so it just comes with the time that people, whenever they have careers and stable lifestyles, they're able to commit more time to volunteering for things on their spare time. But we're trying to kind of counteract that and try to get more young people involved. So we're trying to make it a bit more accessible. Obviously, volunteering is a great thing to do if you have time and if you have the means to support yourself. Yeah, so youth representation faces a lack of accessibility because a lot of the opportunities rely on voluntary input that isn't often available to a lot of people, and it isn't accessible for a lot of people to take on voluntary roles if they do not have other means of income to support themselves. So something that I've learned in my experience in civil society is that one of the really important tools that everyone needs in order to be successful and to have an impact is that they need to be able to rely on a network. And this can be a network of parliamentarians who can advocate for their things in parliament, or other activists or other civil society organizations. And that network kind of inherently comes with time and with knowing people who know people. And so if you're trying to create substantive youth representation, especially youth representation that is ran by youth activists, it kind of inherently faces this roadblock of not having and not moving into an established network that already exists. And so there is this issue that is being faced in which youth representation, there are tons of young people who really want to get involved, but they're unable to enter into the conversation because they don't have that network of people that they can rely on. And so that is a huge issue that I think spans across lots of different issues, not just nuclear disarmament.
Yeah.
But for Youth for TPNW, what we're doing is we've been able to kind of insert ourselves into the ICANN Partners Network and establish a presence with them. And I think the way that the TPNW and the civil society surrounding the TPNW has been constructed is to be entirely, completely collaborative. And so we've been able to join this network and rely on different civil society organizations to cross-promote and amplify our voices, just as we will cross-promote and amplify theirs in a way that has been really effective into getting into the conversation itself.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think it opens up to a lot of wider issues to do with accessibility that I think not only, of course, impact youth, for example, but also like a lot of marginalized groups like POC, women, for example. Financial accessibility, I think, is something to be said. I know you mentioned it at some point about, for example, unpaid internships. Not all young people will have the same means to be able to do, for example, volunteer work. And at the moment, a lot of those opportunities that are out there, especially in this field, are volunteer-based.
Yeah, definitely.
Really agree with that in terms of kind of that community-based collective action, in terms of building that network of trust and familiarity so that there's space for learning and there's space to actually like break through that very, very subtle glass, I'd say ceiling, but it's like a wall because you just can't get through into the space. So yeah, that's really, really interesting.
Yeah, I agree.
Obviously, we've talked a bit about accessibility and some of the challenges people face, which is really important. And I'm sure some, or if not all of us here are familiar with that. So kind of in light of those things, what do you think young people can do if they're interested in getting involved?
Well, I think, first of all, if you're interested in nuclear disarmament, is to consider joining Youth for TPNW. And also just to kind of utilize your role as a young person. I think young people have the benefit, in a general sense, have the benefit of being more social, more literate within social media and being able to engage with things with new technologies. And that is a really great thing. So to utilize that and reach out and engage with and create your own profiles, engaging with these issues online is a really great way to kind of establish a presence. But beyond that, you can do really simple things for nuclear disarmament. You can lobby and write letters to different MPs. There's lots of different letter writing campaigns that ICANN promotes and also other civil society organizations promote themselves. You know, you could try and lobby for your local city council to consider joining the ICANN Cities Initiative, which would indicate that that city does not wish to have or endorse nuclear weapons. Or you can track different changes in regards to nuclear divestment, which would be different companies and banks and organizations kind of lobbying for them to not spend their money on nuclear arsenals and companies that fund nuclear arsenals. There's so many different things that you can do. And I think when I look at this from my perspective, whenever I started approaching the issue of nuclear disarmament, I found it really daunting because I found it like to be such a huge issue. And I think beyond just the general gist of nuclear disarmament, it's such a truly multifaceted issue in regards to, you know, its disproportionate effect on women or on Indigenous populations, or the impact that these weapons will have on climate devastation. Because it is so multifaceted, you can approach the topic from a perspective that engages you the most. So there are organizations that attack the issue of nuclear weapons from a feminist perspective. And so if you are interested and really passionate about gender equality, you can join an organization or just engage with an organization that approaches it from that perspective as well. You don't have to do everything at once, because I found it daunting. When I speak to other people, they found it quite a huge issue that was hard to approach. And so I know it sounds so cliche, but the most impactful work and the most meaningful changes happen when you actually care about what you're doing. So if you care about something already, if you already care about climate change, then it's really great to engage with it on that level, because then it's just going to be more interesting for you, but also better in the long run for everyone. And I think if you don't have time or you don't have resources to engage with these things, to join organizations or anything, it's just really important to be able to kind of stay up to date with the developments of the nuclear debate and to stay informed. I think beyond, if you can't join an organization, it's just really important to kind of know what's going on.
I think that really links into a point you mentioned earlier about social media. It's definitely your friend as a young person. It's a huge advantage we have, as you say, for kind of keeping informed. but also, finding opportunities and developing your network and making yourself visible to the community. So that social media literacy that you talk about is really key. I guess similar to that is in our university network, which is basically our program at Meto, which provides a space for young people across the world to gain experience in the peace and disarmament field. We try to tailor the experiences to suit the needs of the young people. So as you talk about, it can be a bit daunting to enter this sort of space because there is so much information out there and there are lots of conflicting views and considerations. So what we try to do is, as I say, tailor that experience to suit their needs. So we kind of put on things like educational courses. So recently there was one on treaty writing and international law, which was really successful. And hopefully people can take that and learn more. And I think one of the roles of these organizations is to educate the younger generations so that it makes it more accessible and allows their voices to be heard more effectively.
Definitely. Just in terms of that social media thing, I think Jacob and I have had a lot of conversations about how a lot of the opportunities that we've stumbled across came from being very present on social media and building that personal profile and making an effort to speak with people that otherwise, like, for example, you wouldn't really get the chance to meet a diplomat from Geneva, but you really don't have anything to lose getting in touch with them and saying that you're really interested in their work and do they have any tips for you or opportunities and that kind of thing. So I would always urge young people, I think, to get past that fear. I think imposter syndrome is a huge thing that I think all of us have at some stage or still deal with. And I think it's about encouraging one another to kind of break past it, because otherwise there are so many missed opportunities. Sometimes if you don't ask and don't insert yourself in that space, I think that's where the solidarity of community comes from, like the university network and Youth for TPNW. But that being said, I think it's quite important to acknowledge the responsibility of the organizations that we're talking about and civil society actors and also institutions who do have the means, whether it be financial or structural or just in terms of their name and their kind of political capital. What could we say that they should be doing to ensure that meaningful, constructive opportunities are actually being afforded to young people, and not only being afforded on a very tokenistic sense in terms of, oh, look, we have a young person, they're not getting paid, but we plaster their face on social media all the time so that it looks like we're inclusive, but actually giving learning opportunities, letting those young people implement themselves into the space and contribute?
Yeah, so I think the first really obvious one is obviously to avoid offering unpaid opportunities and to, if you have the means to pay someone to do that, that's an obvious one. That's not a controversial statement to make. And moving beyond that, I think something that I've noticed being in and around the sphere of international law and looking at job opportunities, I would suggest that these organizations try to avoid giving opportunities that are reliant on the person relaying some element of something traumatic that's happened to them. Because I've seen a few opportunities advertised that necessitate the person applying to discuss how they've been treated in this sphere or how their perspective as someone who's been discriminated against has impacted them. And whilst those perspectives are really important to be incorporated, it veers so far into tokenism and so far into just checking boxes that it doesn't really create a meaningful opportunity. And also for some people, it's not nice to talk about something traumatic that's happened to them. And so in order to be forced to do that to get a meaningful opportunity is really superficial. But I think in terms of there are some positive things, something that the pandemic has shown, one of the very few positives the pandemic has shown is that the availability for remote working has opened opportunities for so many more people because you're not limited to geography. For example, I outside of Youth for TPNW, work with issues relating to Scottish nuclear disarmament, but I don't live in Scotland right now. I'm doing it all remotely, and I wouldn't have had that opportunity if we weren't able to work remotely. So keeping remote working open and keeping things open to more populations other than just the people who are able to commute in and out of an office is a really great opportunity. I think more broadly, the final point is just to try to avoid creating these opportunities that subscribe so completely to quote unquote Western cultural norms. Especially with the nuclear disarmament, it's a global issue. So it's really important to approach it from a global perspective. And activism is going to look different and take different forms all across the world. So it's limiting it to what you know, and limiting these opportunities to take the forms of what you know isn't going to be as effective as it could be. And it is going to limit participation. And so it's important to acknowledge that having a wide range of perspectives means that they will take different forms, but that is so much better than limiting it to what you know.
That's brilliant. Thank you. I agree. It can be really frustrating when organizations sort of waste young talent. because as Youth for TPNW and the university network at Meto demonstrate, when young people are kind of harnessed effectively and get to really get involved, then they can make some great changes. And I think that's something that organizations could benefit from learning and experiencing. So moving on then, as a young person with specific experience in this field, and your kind of legal background, do you think that the legal framework provides useful tools for ensuring that there's intersectional representation in this sort of area?
I think that the idea of effective intersectional representation is very hard to define. But I think in regards to international law, a really great way to define it is to kind of connect it to the amount of civil society representation that is allowed, because often that important intersectional representation is linked to the voices that can be heard, and these voices are represented by different civil society organizations. So for instance, just knowing about the different civil society organizations that exist that advocate for nuclear disarmament, there are organizations that advocate on behalf of Indigenous populations or women or anything. So those are kind of trying to ensure that level of representation. Within the framework of international law, there are some structures that exist that allow for civil society participation to be impactful. For example, whenever every state goes through a periodic review of their human rights obligations with the OHCHR, and civil society organizations are allowed to submit complaints against the state within these reviews. And those, when they're submitted officially, have to be considered, and they have to be implemented in some way. Whether or not they're successful is down to the complaint and down to all of the nuances of what is being argued. But that is a great tool for ensuring civil society representation, and thus ensuring that everyone's voices are at least being heard on some level. But there are some issues, conversely, that take away from that. I think within nuclear disarmaments, a lot of people point to this kind of paradox, which is, the 5 veto-holding members of the UN Security Council are all nuclear weapons states. And so that means that they're obviously going to veto any sort of resolutions that would attempt to enforce nuclear disarmament in any way, which could be an attempt to kind of create or form reparations for communities affected or anything. And so that is kind of a paradoxical thing where you're trying to get representation and you're trying to get states to participate within these treaties, but there are some states that have more power over others. So it's kind of a give and take type of thing. So whenever you look at the international law framework, you kind of move towards how civil society is being represented within these treaties. So if you look at the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which precedes the TPNW, civil society representation at their review conferences is almost completely limited, and it's almost completely shut out. And that kind of allows for the NPT to continue to be dominated by the security doctrine of the nuclear weapon states. And it does limit the effectiveness of intersectional representation. So when you look at the TPNW, which is taking a completely opposite approach to that and really trying to ensure that there is effective civil society representation as wide as it can possibly be, that is a positive, and it's looking towards kind of shaping the framework to allow for as much intersectional representation as possible.
Brilliant. That's really interesting. I know we spoke once and I was saying that I don't really have any kind of legal knowledge and that kind of thing. So it's really interesting when you kind of approach these issues from that legal perspective and you talk about what the actual impact of the legal space is in terms of this. And moving further on that, the TPNW, I think its ratification's entry into force was a huge moment in terms of the wide global international disarmament movement. And I think it really boosted a lot of optimism and hope surrounding the issue. I think, for example, with the NPT, there's been a lot of cynicism about it. A lot of people called it outdated. I think the TPNW restored the kind of active hope and commitment of states and individuals and social actors to rally around this issue. But on the flip side, there are, of course, a lot of people who are continuing to be cynics about it. And they argue that, for example, a treaty like this entering into international law is redundant because of, as you mentioned, for example, the absence of the P5 states, or the fact that inevitably some states will divert from the treaty and they won't abide by all of its terms and that kind of thing. So what would you say to them?
Okay, so firstly, I think it's a really great question. Moving away from the treaty, the success or the failure, which I don't believe there will be a failure of this treaty, but the success or failure or the redundancy or non-redundancy of this treaty doesn't change the fact that under the principles of international humanitarian law, nuclear weapons are illegal. And the use of them would be considered a war crime. So the treaty doesn't impact that, and it doesn't impact the way that those principles work. To use nuclear weapons is a crime against humanity, and it will be regardless of the status of the TPNW, because it violates the principles of distinction and proportionality. Moving on to the absence of P5 states, when you look at previous treaties that have banned different forms of weapons that violate international humanitarian law. For example, the Ottawa Convention on Anti-Personnel Mines, that treaty, that convention existed and states did ratify it, but once enough states joined the treaty, it was actually enveloped into customary international law, which means that despite which individual states have or have not ratified it, every nation is obligated to adhere to it, regardless of their ratification status. And so the Ottawa Convention passed and anti-personnel mines were unequivocally banned, despite the fact that it was not signed by the US or Russia. And so that is quite compelling precedent for the TPNW. So if we do come to a future where enough states have signed it, but the P5 states have not, there is established precedent in which nuclear weapons could be unequivocally banned and the treaty could be enveloped into customary international law. Now, moving on to the actual treaty itself, the success of the TPNW up to this point signifies like a massive paradigm shift away from the quote-unquote security doctrine that has governed the nuclear debate for so many years. And it's kind of moved this conversation away from security and onto humanitarianism and saying we need to ban these weapons for humanitarian reasons, as opposed to we need to keep these weapons because of our security. And so that has been like a massive shift that is quite unprecedented in terms of different international law activism. And so this has meant that P5 states and all nuclear states are now having to justify why they believe their national security concerns take precedent over humanity, which is increasingly more and more difficult because it's hard to say that you need to keep weapons for your security when more and more people are forcing you to establish that they are going to be a crime against humanity and using them would be inhumane. And so that paradigm shift has already meant so much success. I mean, if you see the different statements that different P5 states have either published or endorsed on behalf of other states, they have acknowledged the humanitarian change, this humanitarian initiative, to such an extent where as more states will continue to join the treaty, I feel they will feel more pressure to establish a more concrete and more compelling argument than the security doctrine, which in my view and in everyone's views does not exist. And so that kind of will be able to push the P5 states, hopefully push the P5 states into the TPNW. But beyond that, I think a lot of people will say that the TPNW is redundant due to the existence of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And I think given that there are many people that point to the NPT as the prevailing and like kind of necessary nuclear treaty, it's important to acknowledge that the NPT is not fit for purpose anymore and that the TPNW is kind of a necessary extrapolation of the NPT, especially of Article 6 of the NPT, which forces states to pursue disarmament. And so it means that the TPNW is a natural follow-on from the NPT. And if all of the states were able to engage with the NPT, it bears well that they'll be able to engage with the TPNW in the future.
That is brilliant. Thank you. I think that's a really nice optimistic note to end you. Honestly, I think we could go on for hours. You have so much really interesting, meaningful knowledge to like contribute to this issue. And I think it's so interesting. But in the interest of time, I think we should leave it there. Thank you so much, Christina, for joining us and for a really, really interesting episode. So it might be one of my favorites so far. Just as a reminder to anyone listening, both Youth for TPNW and the Mato University Network have lots of opportunities to, as we've mentioned, get young people like yourselves involved in the work towards new international disarmament. Once this episode is released, we will drop all of our socials as well and links to both of our pages and our network so that you can kind of have a look if you're interested in getting involved and if there are any opportunities that might suit you. And as a reminder, again, we are also on social media, the In the Zone podcast on Spotify, YouTube, and SoundCloud under the handle @WMD3ME. And our episodes are released usually once a month, and you can listen to all of them on those platforms. Thank you so much for listening.